I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons, and I'll be doing a Kingsguard roll call after today's video.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we're going to be reviewing in a no-spoiler fashion Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. Cue guitar riff. If I feel like I added that in editing, it's probably not going to happen. Also, my camera is trying to pick up Robert Baratheon's face back here, so if the focus goes out in this video, I do apologize. There's no way I'm moving Bobby B from the background, however. So Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. This was the random Patreon pick for, I think it was May, and my good friend Ben from Down Under actually recommended this, and this was his pick, and I'm so glad that he did choose this because I had a really good time reading this. Kings of the Wyld came out maybe 2-3 years ago now at this point, and it went through the classic cycle of new releases, it seems, that are well received here in the book community, especially online, and it was heaped on with praise and praise and praise, and a lot of the opinions of it are very favorable. And then, as I watched the narrative switch, and some people were saying, this is actually not that good. This actually isn't as amazing as everyone was saying. So I enjoy reading a book kind of after its hype period because I get to see what both sides are saying and then come to my own conclusions. I think expectations play a major role in the way that we receive books and how we experience them. A Critical Dragon actually did a wonderful video about this, I think about 2 weeks ago, if you want to go check that out on his channel. And I do a decent job of setting my expectations when I go into a new read. I'm certainly not perfect, but I do try to be studious about it and try to be fair to the book and read it and not force my expectations upon it. So with all that said, is Kings of the Wyld the most genre-defining work I've read in the last 10 years, and is it doing something so inventive that we've never seen before? No, it's not. Not at all, in fact. I think there's a lot of recycled things in here that we know from good old-fashioned fantasy, but is it a romping good time? Did I have fun reading this? Did my expectations kind of line up with what I got? Yeah, it did, and I'm glad I read this. I actually enjoyed it maybe even a little bit more than I thought I would. Some of the criticisms that I have heard did ring true, but overall I thought the positives outweighed the negatives, and if you're someone who is only here for high literature and the best of the best, this may not be your bag. For me, I'm down with a good romp in old time, and this story kind of takes place around a group of past their primed heroes, a mercenary band, and in this world, it's all treated like rock stars, right? So mercenary bands equal rock bands, kind of how the story goes, which I think is an interesting concept. That's something that I myself would like to write about one day, maybe. I love past your prime heroes or warriors or whatever. So immediately the premise does work for me. It has a little bit of that D&D vibe. It is lighthearted in just the right ways. I think it's also self-aware to a certain extent that really helps with some of the more tropey things or the recycled themes and all of these things that we know and love in fantasy. I think that makes it just a little bit fresher than it probably has a right to be. But yeah, this one kind of crept up on me because while it is lighthearted in tone, it also has some moments that genuinely evoked some emotion from me. And maybe I'm just a wimp. Maybe I am a weeper, as R. Scott Baker would say. But I don't know. There was times where this really hit home for me in some way. And it reminds me of a show I love called Parks and Recreation. I'm sure you probably have heard of it. But it's a show at its core is very self-aware of how silly it is. But whenever you end up getting to a more monumental moment, you realize that there's like this gravity around the situation just because of how good you feel reading it, or in that case, watching it. And then you're kind of taken back. You're kind of surprised that maybe you feel something inside that isn't just, laughing and lightheartedness. And that's kind of my experience with Kings of the Wyld, which I know is a wild way of comparing this to something, but I kept thinking about Parks and Rec for some reason whenever I read this book, just for its execution and its tone. Nicholas Eames chose a third-person omniscient perspective, and it kind of centers around a main character named Clay Cooper, who is being pulled back into his old mercenary band so he can go rescue one of his bandmates' daughters. Yeah, that's pretty fine. I thought that was okay. I thought the inciting event of what convinces him finally to move was kind of like, let's just get through it so we can get on the journey, which is this type of book. But at first it did kind of feel jarring, but I was like, well, what else do you expect? It's only like 400 pages. It's not a super thick book by any means, right? So this gets over and done pretty quickly. So they didn't spend too much time on the Catalyst event, in my opinion, which is fine. But we get off and going, and the mercenary band is getting back together. And the cast of characters I did find endearing, to be honest with you. I don't think everything about it was amazing, but I did enjoy them quite a bit. Especially Moog. Moog was probably the highlight of the book for me in a lot of ways. I would love to get a novella of just him, and him just doing things. Because that was the character I probably found the most endearing, the most lighthearted, the one that I was attached to the most, even though a lot of the inner dialogue that we get from Clay's mind is also pretty relatable. And between all of the band, the thing that I came to appreciate is that I really believed in their relationships. I also believed in the world that they were experiencing, and some of the best fantastical things, and also some of the most grim, and there's a lot of grim and horrifying things, are also kind of matter of fact. And it just makes you feel like this world isn't being so much told to you as it just is, and it's real. And that came across the page very, very well. As well as with a whole band of heroes, sometimes it can just rely on the fact that that's what they are, and they're going across, the country trying to go on this mission, right? But the thing I really appreciated about this being a past your prime warrior story is the fact that these people haven't seen each other in many, many years. And it's not even so much about their past relationships, or more about in the time they've been away, how they have morphed, how they have sat on events that caused them not to be together anymore, and where they ended up. So it was almost more about the maturing of the band when they were split up, and then coming back together and having to resolve some of the conflicts that they had before. It just felt like actual real progression, and more about who they had become rather than who they were. And despite being full of old school tropes, your typical kind of quest storyline, that D&D feel, like I said, there does seem to be a freshness about this. And like I said, I don't know if it's because it is self-aware, or if it's because I like some of the inspirations that it's taking. Lilith, if that's how you pronounce it in the book, is a character that does some devious things, and she is, I think, a callback to an enemy of God back from like biblical times. So whenever I saw her on page and saw what she was doing, I was like, oh, that's what he's doing. He's pulling inspiration from that. Now Lilith, in the character that's based off from the Bible, this has actually been in different mythologies and tales out throughout history. But that's something that maybe people will think is like kind of recycled. But for me, I like that inspiration. I actually found that to be pretty cool, in the fact that I could recognize it was almost like an Easter egg for my own nerdiness. And when it comes to the actual writing, I don't necessarily think that the author's writing is like the most top tier of all time. But I think it's a little bit better than I see it given credit for whenever I watch some of the criticisms that people put upon this book. He is a huge fan of Guy Gavriel Kay, among other writers, and we all know Guy Gavriel Kay is phenomenal, at least in my opinion, in his prose. I think that the tone of the writing is so in tune with what the world is trying to get across, and just really the vibes that Kings of the Wyld brings to the table. And this is page 170, no real spoilers, but just listen to this description. The air itself was a wild brawl of smells and sounds. The punch of unwashed flesh, the scream of a scratching mandolin, the jab of tobacco smoke, the glee of a whistling pipe, the occasional headbutt of sour urine, the aching sorrow of a moaning lute. All that in voices singing, laughing, yelling, swearing, and groaning in a myriad of different ways. So, the brawl of the smells, the fact that there's a little bit of a headbutt of sour urine, like these things are, one, kind of described lightheartedly, but also like you get a sense that a brawl, like this is a fight, this is kind of, it's kind of grimy, it's kind of grungy in a way. And I think that it is trying to encapsulate like rock music to a certain extent. There's a load of musical references in here that I didn't really catch or care about. So if you're worried that this is going to be too musically inspired to where you're going to have to get those references for this to be a good book, that is not the case at all. But yeah, that writing, yeah, it is not the most flowery purple prose or overly descriptive, but it does fit the tone of this book, does it not? So I don't know. I think that I came away from this having a lot more respect for his craft than I thought I would. I thought that this would just be a bang, 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 quick romp 'em and stomp 'em. It is that. But I also did think that his writing was pretty good. Now I'm going on and on about the lightheartedness, and there is a little bit of grimness here, definitely, and there's some levity to the situations that these characters are getting placed in, and the world that they're living is very, very dangerous. But this book does rely a lot on humor, and humor is so subjective. You have to read it at the right time of day or in the right mood, or all these things, the way it's executed. I liked a lot of the humor in this book. There were multiple times where I laughed out loud. I think I even told my wife some of the passages. I did tell my best friend one of the passages for sure. I sent him a picture of it. I just thought it was so funny However, there are times wherever like some of, even just like the characterization is so low level, and I don't mean like down in the details. I mean, it kind of feels a little bit lazy at some points. There's low hanging fruit that's being picked by the author at some of these situations. For instance, there's a character and they overeat. Okay, like whatever, that happens all the time in fantasy. But like they're referred to or even named, I think was like Piglet or something like that. And it's like, fine, I'm not offended by that or whatever, but like, I don't know, you're gonna write something for millions of people possibly to read, like what if this is the next big hit? And that was like what you were like, yeah, I'm gonna write that down. That's gonna be dope. I don't know. You do you, dude. I don't have a problem with it technically. I mean, you can do whatever you want with your story. But when I read that, I was just like, that just doesn't feel as well crafted as some of the other aspects of the humor even, but the book overall. And there's other examples of that. For instance, the rot, which at first I thought was kind of cool. I don't necessarily think that this ailment in the world is like all that great. I'll let you figure it out when you read the book. But I don't know, the rot kind of felt like low level. It kind of felt like low hanging fruit in a lot of ways. And I don't know. I didn't like that representation in the story all that much. It didn't ruin the story for me, clearly. I like this book. I actually think it's really solid. But there are aspects here where I almost felt like if it had just been taken a different direction or there had been more nuance added to some of these things, it could have been good. And the humor does suffer from that as well. There's some low-hanging fruit that's taken. Take it or leave it. I mean, some people love that. Some people will probably read that and be like, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard. Like, I'm sure people out there love it. But when I read that, it just, for how hard I laughed at other parts of the book where I thought the humor was either like really on the nose or also like subtly clever, that was just like kind of low effort, in my opinion. That's just my subjective taste in humor. I know it's different for everybody, but that's kind of how I found it. But largely the humor did land with me, and there are some really inspiring moments in this book. In my opinion, the final speech of this book got me so like ramped up and ready to go. I think I even like typed in my Discord, like, this was just awesome. Like, this speech was good. I want more of this. It almost makes me want to see him write something that's maybe even just a little bit more serious, but I don't know. You don't want to mess with the secret sauce or the recipe too much. And maybe this is the kind of stories he wants to tell, which are totally cool, but it had me wanting more. Like, I was immediately at that point saying, okay, I'm going to read more stuff from this author. I know Bloody Rose is out, so I will try that at some point, probably next year. But that final speech was excellent, and I thought that the ending was just an absolute heater. Like, I thought it was sick. But it could have used a little bit more time to breathe, in my opinion. I almost wish this book was maybe 50 to 100 pages longer, or maybe you cut out the beginning just a little bit more. But I don't know. It definitely wasn't too short, wasn't too long, probably stayed around just the right amount of time. But I thought the ending kind of just like went off a cliff, after a really solid climax. It was just a little too quick for me. I enjoyed this book. I did. I do not think it's the genre-defining thing, masterpiece that we've all been waiting for, or anything like that. But I do think it's a very solid modern piece of fantasy, and it's something that I believe is a debut novel. So also, you always try to factor that in whenever you're taking in your impressions of a book. At least I do. And I will be reading more from Nicholas Eames. I definitely will read Bloody Rose. I know the reception is very mixed on that book. It seems like some people think it's better, some people think it's worse. But overall, I'm pumped. I'm pumped to try out some more of his works, and for a good romp-em quest, good time, I liked it. It even, at times, even tugged on my heartstrings just a little bit. So if you're someone who wants to read a book, have a good time, and it goes by pretty damn quick, this is for you. Also, the audiobook is fantastic. And that'll do it for the no spoiler review of Kings of the Wyld. I want to thank you for checking out this video. If you like this book, hit like. If you dislike, you can hit dislike. If you love it, you can think about subscribing. I do all types of book reviews here on the channel. I also have a bookish podcast I do every 2 weeks called Chatting with Nuts. It's kind of my main thing here on the channel. I'd love to have you around for that. There is a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. And get down below and let me know, did you like Kings of the Wyld? Have you tried it? What are your expectations going in? Did your expectations affect you going in? Because I feel like because I took this so lightly, that it ended up being exactly what I wanted it to be, which is always a good feeling. So until I see you next time, be good, be safe. Remember to always keep turning the page.
I want to give a big shout out to my Kingsguard, which are my top tier patrons, which include Lauren, Henrik, Kai, Simon, Oscar, Stuart, Josephine, Ikaika, Amanda, who's the lore master, RJ, Shad, Nicoletta, Tanner, Jennifer, Garrick, Frank, Evie, Fever, Jay, Sarah, Pat, Kevin, Ryan, Michael, Terrence, Wade, Darren, My Book is Lit, Dairy, John C., Bass, Mitch, Sebastian, Benjamin, Jobot, Welcome to My Mind, Noel, Amanda L., and Kyle. Thank you all so much. You're the best.